Ashes of the Forgotten. A witness. A war crime. A world that wants to forget. Part 1. Echoes in the Dust. Chapter 1. The Hooded Man. They burned the bodies. He remembered the names. Ash fell like snow. Silent, indifferent. The village had no name now. Not officially. Just coordinates. A square on a map grayed out by bureaucracy and war. Roan stepped through the ruins, his bare feet stirring up dust where children once played. A gray sackcloth cloak draped over his shoulders, the hood casting his face in permanent twilight. He looked like a ghost, but he bled like a man. His sandals had long worn down to threads. Beneath the layers of cloth, his ribs pressed sharp against skin like a xylophone of famine and memory. He stopped before the blackened stump of what had once been a school bell tower. The brass bell lay cracked on the ground, half buried in soot. Roan crouched slowly, fingers tracing words etched into the side by some forgotten hand. No class today. The sky fell instead. He stood. Then he spoke. Not prose, not speech. A verse, the kind that didn't ask for permission. In room 5, the chalk still weeps for names it could not hold. There, where laughter dared to live. The dust was bought and sold. His voice was low. A rasp carried on wind. But the sound had weight. Somewhere behind him, the wind shifted. A crow perched on the edge of a scorched windowsill let out a cry and lifted off into the ash-gray sky. Roan turned. He waited. Stillness again. He walked on. Each structure he passed was a ruin. A kitchen with no walls. A crib filled with cinders. A rusted tricycle embedded in the dirt like a tombstone with petals. His hand reached out and touched a charred beam. He could still feel the heat. He remembered nothing, and he remembered everything. In the center of the village square, there stood a wall. A strange wall, untouched by fire. A surviving patch of faded white plaster remained, like a blank canvas waiting for sin. Roan reached into the folds of his cloak and pulled out a sharpened nail. He pressed it to the wall and began to scratch. Not a name, not yet. First a line. She danced in the fire and sang with no mouth. The silence applauded. He paused. Then another. What was burned cannot unburn, but the ash remembers. It wasn't poetry for beauty's sake. These verses were maps, testimonies, evidence. Every line a whisper from the dead that no one wanted to hear. It was absurd if you thought about it. The government had declared the war was over. Peace had returned. The reconstruction posters even featured smiling children. Stock images imported from somewhere else. The official record said this village had been evacuated. Humanely. Roan stared at his words until blood began to bead on his fingers. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did. He stepped back, looked at what he'd written. They burned the bodies. He remembered the names. The line wasn't his. It was Sari's. His daughter. Or maybe a memory of her. Sometimes she came to him in dreams, speaking in riddles. Other times she was just a laugh that echoed where no children lived. He turned away from the wall. The light had dimmed. Twilight was approaching. That was when the jackals came. Not the kind with fur. He walked east. Across the border, in a university archive lit by fluorescent buzz and too much bureaucracy, a young woman stared at a satellite photo. Her name was Lena Dawes, and something about that cracked wall in that grayed-out village drew her breath short. Not because of the poetry, because of the symbol beneath it. A symbol she'd seen once before, carved into the corner of an old family photo, behind her mother's smile. A triangle with a tear. She zoomed in, froze the image, printed it. Her hands trembled slightly. She'd told herself she was just compiling data. A reconstruction audit. Dead villages were just data sets. Collateral damage from a necessary war. That's what the textbook said. But the man in the photo, hooded, barefoot, inscribing verse into a ruin with a nail, was no ghost. He was the reason her mother screamed in her sleep. Back in the ruins, Roan found a shattered porcelain plate and pressed it gently into the ground, face up, like a marker for someone the world had forgotten. He wrote no name on it. Not yet. The names came later. First came the remembering. Then came the mourning. Then, the fire. He whispered one last line before walking on. Peace is what they name the silence when the screamers are all gone. The crows followed, and far behind, a pair of boots crunched into the same village from the opposite side. Polished, military issue. The man wearing them wore gloves and carried a silent weapon. He'd been paid to erase what the war had missed. But that was the problem with ghosts. You couldn't kill what remembered you. Chapter 2. Graffiti in Ash. Peace is what they name the silence when the screamers are all gone. The wall was supposed to be gone. According to the satellite records, the eastern quadrant of the village, Sector V7D, labeled Uninhabited Hazard Zone, had been structurally flattened 3 years ago. A cleanup initiative. Return to Earth, they'd called it. The idea was to bury the past under pavement, scrub it from maps, scrub it from minds. But the wall stood, Lena Dawes stood before it now, her boots crunching on glass and soot, her breath sharp in the cold morning air. The village was quiet in the way abandoned places always were. Too quiet. As if time didn't dare move here. She raised her camera slowly and took the shot. Click. Click. Each press of the shutter felt like a violation. The wall was cracked, blistered from fire, its top edge jagged like broken teeth. Yet somehow, impossibly, the graffiti remained, unfaded, unscathed, like it had burned itself into the plaster. At first glance, it looked like nonsense. Verses scrawled in uneven lines, the kind of rambling seen in delusional survivors or rebel punks trying to romanticize rubble. But Lena knew language. She'd been trained to see meaning beneath the mess, structure hidden in chaos. She read the first stanza aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. They came at night with paper smiles and said we were already dead. They did not bury our bodies. They buried the proof instead. Goosebumps formed along her arms. Not from the cold. There were more lines. Fragments. Below them, hand-scratched symbols she'd seen only once before. In a case file marked, "Do not pursue." The tear inside the triangle. The same one etched on the back of her mother's last photograph. She snapped more photos, zooming in. The script wasn't just graffiti. It was documentation, testimony, a kind of reverse archive. Evidence the state couldn't delete because it didn't exist anywhere except here. In dust, in ash. In this man's words, Lena knelt, brushing debris from the base of the wall. There, etched just above the foundation, was a single name. Sorry. She stopped breathing. Her mother's name was Sarah, but she had once whispered in her sleep again and again, "Sorry, no, not sorry," as though correcting a dream. Lena's pulse quickened. Coincidence didn't live here. Not in places where no one was supposed to have survived. She opened her field tablet and began voice transcription. Subject, Sector V7D coordinates, 38.772N, 42.315, visual presence of unsanctioned verse graffiti. Content suggests direct witness to war crimes. Verses reference systematic execution, body concealment, and falsified evacuations. Poem uses terms previously redacted in state memorial documents, including vanished and buried proof. Name found, sorry. She paused the recording. The wind shifted. Dust moved across the broken concrete like a warning. In the distance, crows shrieked. Lena stood and scanned the horizon. Nothing. No movement. Still, her hand went to her bag and tightened around the pepper device she wasn't technically allowed to carry. Her tablet pinged. A signal had been intercepted. Government drones had passed overhead 6 hours prior. That meant surveillance was already 2 steps ahead. She was not alone in this zone. Not for long. She knew the rules. Don't linger in closed coordinates. Don't document anomalies. And for God's sake, don't speak to the ghosts. But this wasn't a ghost. It was a man. She could feel it in the rhythm. The meter was too controlled to be madness. The choice of words, too deliberate. This man had witnessed. Another verse caught her eye, scratched horizontally like a scar. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering with eyes wide open. It wasn't just poetry. It was provocation. This was truth weaponized in metaphor. A memory that refused to die. She stepped back and looked again at the wall, this time not as an archivist, but as a daughter. Had her mother known this man? Had she survived something Lena had only read in censored reports and classified appendices? The wall seemed to breathe now, its cracks like veins, its words alive, and in her chest something ancient stirred. Not curiosity, not even grief. Rage. How many lives had been reduced to rumors? How many names like sorry had been marked down as statistical error? She activated her satellite uplink and began transmitting the images to her private server. Not the state archive, not her employer. This was too raw, too dangerous. As the upload processed, she heard the sound. A footstep. No echo. Just pressure, soft, deliberate on the fractured stone behind her. She turned. Nothing. Only shadows. A faint flutter of ash. But on the far wall, opposite the graffiti, something new had appeared. A single line, freshly carved. "You found me." She hadn't noticed it earlier. It hadn't been there earlier. The hairs on her arms lifted. Her camera swung upward, but the screen caught only the blur of wind and dust. No figure. No movement. The verse shimmered in the morning light. Not metaphorically. Physically. As if it had been written with heat. Lena whispered to no one, "Who are you?" And the silence replied, not in sound, but in memory. Her mother's voice, low and trembling in a dream once overheard. "They left us burning. Only one of us walked away." She looked back at the wall. The man who had written this verse, he was still walking. Somewhere. Chapter 3. The memory that won't burn. What was burned cannot unburn, but the ash remembers. It always began the same way. Smoke, but not the kind that rises. The kind that descends, a choking fog that wraps around the ribs and refuses to let go. Roan stood in the remains of what used to be a classroom. There were no desks anymore, no blackboard. Only blackness, only boards. The smell never left. Not truly. Burnt paper, burnt hair. The strange sweetness of cooked grain. Porridge boiling in pots forgotten on stoves as the screams began. His feet shifted on the concrete, bone white and soft. Ash ground beneath his toes. Then the bell. It rang in his memory like a child shouting from the bottom of a well. Room 5. The chalk cried first. Roan whispered it without knowing he had. The poem always arrived like that. Not composed, released. His fingers grazed the wall, and it all returned again. Not clearly. Never clearly. Flash! The men in uniforms with no insignia. Clean boots, but their eyes were the dirtiest thing about them. Laughter, mechanical, cracked and wrong. Flash. The woman shielding a child with her body, as if flesh could deflect fire. He knew that woman. He was sure of it, or once had been. The way her hands curved over the child's back. The way she screamed only after the child stopped. That scream had no end. Flash. The soldier lighting a torch with a cigarette hanging from his mouth. Flash. The child with the red ribbon. Then blackness. A blank square in the middle of his memory. Always there. Always sharp at the edges. Like the mind itself had cauterized a wound too deep to leave open. He reached inside his robe, pulled free a folded piece of charcoal wrapped in paper. He found a surviving plaster patch on the wall and scrawled without hesitation. One wore white. One wore red. The third lit the match. The rest wrote poems in blood. He stepped back, breathing hard, not from exertion, from containment. There was always one part he couldn't reach. The scream that wasn't hers. The sound that wasn't the fire. A name, or a face, or a shape. Every time he got close, it was as if his mind slammed shut like a book soaked in rain. His heart beat like it wanted out. He stumbled back into the sunlight, hood falling over his brow. The sun, high and indifferent, bled through the smoke like an eye that didn't blink. He fell to his knees beside a cracked window frame. Beneath it, a scorched wooden toy. A horse, handmade. He touched it gently. It crumbled. And then a voice. Not present, not real, but remembered. High-pitched, joyful, a child's laugh. The kind that bubbles up from the chest like a secret too delightful to keep. Sorry, he whispered. That part he remembered. Her name. Her hands stained with chalk, not blood. Her tiny feet bare and dusty from skipping through ruined corridors. Her joy so radiant it made the war seem like an afterthought. For a while, he had taught her to read. That he remembered too. She had asked once, "Papa, when the sky falls, will the trees catch it?" He had said yes. And when the sky did fall, when the bombs dropped, and the fire licked the doors and walls like a hungry god, the trees did not catch it. Only silence did. He wrote again. I taught her words. The fire stole her sentence. He paused, closed his eyes, listened. Sometimes he could hear the echoes. Sometimes he could not. But today they came. Faint, from deep inside his skull. Children chanting multiplication tables. Then a piano note, just one. Then a silence that rang louder than sound. And then, a voice he did not recognize but that knew him intimately. You saw it all, it said. You wrote it down, then you ran. He shook his head. No, I stayed. But even as he spoke, he wasn't sure. Did he stay? Or did he bury his memory beneath poems so it wouldn't eat him alive? He stood again, legs trembling. He took his charcoal and walked to the last standing wall of the building. There, in jagged print, he etched a final line. I am the man who remembers nothing and everything. Except the end. He dropped the charcoal. His hands were shaking. Because what if the end wasn't the fire? What if the end was what he did in it? He turned sharply at a sound behind him. Just wind, just birds. But he did not feel alone. Because somewhere in the heat-baked wreckage of memory, something was still watching. Not with malice, with truth. A truth his mind had sealed behind smoke and bone. He walked on, cloak trailing ash. Behind him, a single beam collapsed, as if exhaling the last breath of what once was.